Coming up in Part 3, Jake Condon and others continue to share memories of working at the factory. Also, Cummings Properties gives the shoe some major repair. By the late 1980s, the United Shoe had moved to Wilmington, and the factory was sold to Black & Decker. The once proud and internationally recognized business, founded by Sidney Winslow, that dominated the manufacturing of shoe machinery, no longer provided employment to thousands of people on the North Shore. Cummings Properties purchased the contaminated site and began massive renovation.
It's August 1998. We're standing in the main lobby of the Cummings Center, and we're interviewing two of the old United Shoe employees, Jake Condon of Beverly, standing beside one of the machines that's on display here at the Cummings Center. Jake, would you tell us about when you came to work at the Shoe, and tell us something about the machine that's standing behind you?
I came to work in 1946, and I left here in 1961 to be after John Kennedy appointed me postmaster of Beverly, Mass. In those days we were confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Today that's no longer a requirement. The machine behind me is a staple lasting machine. I've made many parts, different parts for this machine. For many years it was a good job. I enjoyed the work here. It was a good company to work for, one of the most progressive companies in the country at that time. The wages were good. I made excellent money here. I worked on A215 as a machine operator. In those days we'd get the people from the Beverly Trade School in a month at a time to teach them how to run the machines, and I enjoyed that very much. It was then the Claude Patton Trade School. Tom Tierney, who you may see later on, was one of the teachers over in the high school when they went over there for a month. Then they come back over in the United Shoe for a month. And Tom had them when they were over the school. I had them when they were in the plant. And it gave them a good, solid background. And most of the managers that were here went through what they call BIS, the Beverly Industrial School, or the Claude Patton Trade School. This brings back a lot of memories because a lot of these parts I made myself. One that brings back memories is this round piece of machinery, and there's what's called a cam. Tony Andreas, one of my neighbors, was in charge of that department over in B2, and he came up with quite a few methods of machining that cam and making it a lot better, making the whole machine a better run machine, quieter, more efficient. I think later on you may see some reference to Tony's name. Tony received quite a few bonuses for the inventions that he came up with.
Oh, I worked at the Shoe, 1950 for a whole year. Ran a drill press, and a lathe, and I didn't like it at all. So after a year, I left the shoe and went into another type of work, over Sylvania. But if you want my name, it's
Go ahead.
Bill Walsh. And I guess there are Bill Walsh. But that's it. Now I'm visiting, and I really like the place. I can't believe it's changed as much as it has. It's been a long way back to 832 was it?
That's where you worked, was 832?
832. As I say, it was a long time ago. My father worked here, my son worked here. I'm surprised to see what it is now.
The shoe was pretty important to Beverly.
Oh yes, oh, it was number one. I can't even remember the end of World War I when my father worked in the shoes. Lived up here on Blaine Avenue. That's a long time ago. I kind of lost track of time.
Thank you. Bruno, when did you come to work at the shoe?
I came to work at the shoe, United Shoe, in 1946. Now, the title was USMC, and I always claimed that it was Useless Sons Made Comfortable. And one had to have a relation before one was hired. And in my case, I had a father-in-law who was a master electrician. In fact, the plant maybe operated on his master electrician's license at the time.
His name was?
Martin L. Maine, who had a son with the same name, followed him a few years later. He worked there also over on the on motors and devices.
Tell us your first impression of this magnificent building behind you in the photograph.
Well, I started work on what they called the night shift in the foundry. I never left the foundry in the 30-odd years that I worked there. And I worked on the night shift, and it was kind of warm there. In fact, there was no conditioning whatsoever, very few fans, and we would work a few minutes and stick our head out the window, gasping for breath. And I'm talking, that was at a young age, and I had previously been in the Navy, used to warmth and what went with it, but the foundry was an altogether new. I had served apprenticeship over in a General Electric at one time, previous to that. But the foundry was a new experience, and it was an exhilarating experience. I was never unhappy that I worked there. I stayed there for 30-odd years. Because of my age, I'd have to take out a pencil and paper to figure out how many years. But I worked there as a molder. I worked what they call squeezer molding. I did a little bench molding, then roll over. And I'm never unhappy when working there. Maybe my latter years there, I broke down physically, and that's what made me retire.
What you see, besides let me add on the windows, I never had any trouble with the cold because the machines threw off some heat, but it was a blessing in the summertime because there was no air conditioning in those days, and you'd open windows on both sides of the building and get a cross breeze of some type. But in the background is a section of what we call a stock room. They had small parts like pop rivets and bolts and nuts. You notice the racks are very, very heavy constructed because even you take a bin of these are pretty heavy. Those are like some of the steel bolts and nuts would weigh up 200-300 pounds for a bin. That's why the chain falls are there. They had to take them off the top rack. They'd take them down with chain falls. Otherwise, you'd get a hernia lifting them.
Were they pretty well organized in their stock rooms?
Yes, at one time, one of the managers told me they could go 6 to 12 years without manufacturing a new part when I worked here. And from the amount of stock they carried, I think they could.
And they were really famous, Jake, for their service out in the field. And being able to replace parts that had broken down.
They'd have they tell me they'd have a serviceman in your shoe factory within a half an hour if you had a machine down and you were manufacturing shoes. I could never understand why they classed it as a monopoly, which is really the start of the downfall of the United Shoe, because most of the shoe manufacturers liked
The service.
that service because they didn't pay for the machines when they weren't using them. They're paying so much a stitch, so much per shoe manufactured.
With the leasing.
Yeah, with the leasing. So when they weren't using the machines, they weren't paying for them.
Anything else in there you want to call attention to?
No, I just happened to see Pop Rivets. I understood they sold that company, but it was, they did all the research, I think over in B2. It was on the same floor as us. They went from something like 16 machines down to 8 or 10 or something. They were always playing around with those. But they're quite a innovation, that Pop Rivet. It's revolutionized a lot of industries because you don't need a lot of equipment. Actually, all it needs is a pure Pop Rivet pliers to use them.
Well,
Give
we
his
had
name.
a fellow years ago, name withheld, who was they wagered that he didn't dare to during lunch hour, and for a few dollars, he climbed his engineering the power plant smokestack, and in fact they practically needed a helicopter to get him down, because when he got up there and looked down, he realized the foolishness he had committed.
Okay, we're into the finished portion of what we refer to as the 900 building, the former foundry building. And you can see what we transformed this from. If you walk this way through this doorway, you can see the old original beam construction and the concrete that has existed since the day this building was put together and built. If you look up, you can see the cross members and all the original concrete we haven't touched. Okay, and finally, you see all the additional work we've been putting into this.
I understand the windows were made here on site for all of the buildings.
Yes, that's true. We have a window shop that's been in operation since we basically took over. And right over in this direction, we have the machineries that we use to create the window frames and all of the windows that have gone into this building. Since such a large project, we had our own window people actually putting together the aluminum windows that are in here now that replace some, I think there's like 2,500 metal windows that we've looked at.
Jake, this is quite a building, isn't it?
And it's quite a bit different than the old foundry, I'll tell you that. It's amazing what's being done over here. I wouldn't believe it if I didn't see it.
I think, Peter, the original structure of the building was deemed quite solid when the Cummings people bought it.
It most definitely was. This is real rugged concrete. From what I've learned about it, it's the best that they've put together. It's got a tremendous amount of aggregate, and the gravel that they used to mix the concrete came right from the site itself. They blasted and ground up the rock ledge and put it to use, and we even did some of that ourselves. The parking lots at the very north end of the complex, where we took out ledge on the northern end of the facility, we ground up and used it as a foundation for the parking lots up towards Wall Street.
In February of 1999, we returned to the Cummings Center with 3 former United Shoe employees and Beverly residents. They discussed with us their long careers at the factory.
My name is Adolph DeRose. I came to the United Shoe 1945, right after the war, 1945. Then I came in as a design engineer, and then various jobs and all the way up to a section head. Some of the early jobs were on automatic shoe machinery, so-called automation. Then I did some work in atomic power, did some work with packaging. And, but one thing I'd like to tell you a story of, and this has to do with patents, how a patent originates. This is back in 1971. We had an idea that we could make a sewing machine to sew cowboy boots. That was something that was could be very labor savings if the machine could be made to do that. Like presently on the way they make cowboy machines, the operator uses his hand as a brake, his hands that guide the boot, and then his foot, so he's always doing this. And for something like this, it took him about maybe 20 minutes. So the thing was, how can we make the machine to cut this down to minutes instead of hours? Well, the patent it's a long story. There's a lot of people involved in the patent. It's just not one man. For instance, on this thing here, this was done in 1971. This is the original sewing of a automatic sewing machine. Now the problem here is if you make a circle on the machine, you get what you call half hitching. If you can see right over here, I don't know how good your camera is, but you can see over here how it half hitches, this side compared to this. So as you sew around the circle, half is good and one half isn't. So how can you, and this will never go on a cowboy boat, never, they never accept this. So the thing was stalled for months after months. What should we do? Should we actually stop making cowboy boats or not? So the only thing, we made some samples. We went down to Tony Lama. Tony Lama they're the Cadillac of the cowboy boots. So we had half a dozen spread out. He says, can you pick out some of these? Give us ratings, A, B, C, D, and they did. And this, gee, it's pretty good. They're all A's and B's. He says, how about this portion here? Well, yeah, that looks a little different. That was a half-inch problem. And they didn't pick it up, so that was it. That was a turning point of the automatic shoe machinery, is that the best inspectors of Tony Lama could not pick up half hitching, so we went ahead. Year after that, the machine went to a show, and year after that, it was just right across the world. And I think since then, they've sold much over 1,000 machines. In fact, it's worth hundreds of millions. No, just what they do nowadays, these are some of the samples they do. For instance, here's 1, 2, 3, and 10. Something an operator couldn't do. And the machine does this in about 5 minutes. 5 minutes, 10 rows, 5 minutes. This is sort of a brief history of the machine. I'm sure a lot of people here take credit, especially the fellows in the field. What they do, they can adjust the machine and the needles so that you cover up the half hitching. Even though it's there, you cannot see it because it's buried underneath the inside the what they call a shaft.
My name is Richard Elliott. I'm almost 82 next week, and I came here in the summer of 36. About 10 of us who were college students were brought in here to work in the research division. At that time it was research division. And we had various jobs. Amongst them were delivering the mail in the group. So we got to know that way most of the people in the division. Then we came back again in 37, the same sort of setup. And then I was lucky, they hired me in 38 as I graduated from Worcester Tech. And there was about, each time there was about 10, 11 of us that came in under those same conditions. And they continued that program for about 4 or 5 more years. We were taken around to different sections in the division and worked at various jobs, just becoming acquainted and becoming more knowledgeable as to the things that were going on in the division. And eventually I was assigned to the engineering section there and stayed there for a short while, about a year or so, and worked with Roy Cummings and Vernon Meyer on what they call motion time analysis. That was so we could design machines and the auxiliaries around the machines to make the operator more efficient, do the job in a quicker time. Then around early 41, there was kind of war problems starting then. And the company, amongst other jobs I got, was a job of trying to improve the anti-aircraft director. Was a mechanical director that never did a very good job at flying, at aiming at airplanes. Was always behind the darn plane. So we had the job of trying to find out what the trouble was and how to correct it. We were working on it when Pearl Harbor was bombed, And we continued to work for another 6, 8 months, I guess it was. And we came up with a device that would actually correct the problems in the thing, and was an easy method to adjust and change in the field to the ones that they already had. But the darn thing never got used because one of the majors, the colonels down at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, decided he didn't like the condensers that we used in the thing. Actually, during the war, there was a lot of jobs done within the division. They developed a lot of servo-controlled anti-aircraft turrets for tanks, the turrets in the airplanes, B-17s, B-24s, that shot out of the tail of a 17, out the side of a 24. Those devices were developed here. And of course, there were many other jobs that but I was working on another job called the hydro bomb. The aircraft, the Air Force, when they were dropping the torpedoes from their planes, or the Navy also, the torpedoes were designed to be shot out of submarines, and when they hit the water, a lot of times they break, or they come out and shoot up into the air and get lost as far as knowing where they aim. So we were given the job of developing a new torpedo hydro bomb, which was a much heavier, thicker, shorter bomb, which could be carried in the bomb bay of an airplane. And we tried to improve the controls, because the controls in the old ones was a pendulum, and when it would hit the water, the shock and everything would upset the pendulum, and when the torpedo accelerated, it would influence the method or the signal from the pendulum. We developed a device using a gyroscope, which was not subject to shocks and false gravity signals. And so we worked, Bob Perrin was one of the fellows that worked with me on that. Of course, I was just working on the controls area and the testing of some concrete dummies that we made up. We used to take down to the Pensacola, Eglin Field. There was the airfield down there the Air Force had. And we do practice runs with these concrete dummies and watch those things go. And sometimes they jump out of the water too. But we devised simple devices that could go on the bomb, and that would help it enter the water and without the danger of bouncing out.
My name is Thomas Tierney. I'm 81 years old. My father came from Europe early in the 1915s and 1916s and got a job in the United Chew because all the American boys had been drafted, and there was opportunities here for the European men to come over and get work here, which they all did. My father worked here for 40 years. I graduated from high school in 1935, and because of my father's record and in the United Chew, I immediately got into the Beverly Cooperative Trade School, which was a program that was set up by the United Chew and the school system in Beverly for that you could go to school one week and learn your related work, and then you went to work in the United Chew the other week, and you worked right on the machines, and you worked piecework, and you got 50% in your pay envelope of what you did. 50% went to the shoe, paying for your education as it was, and 50% for you, and with the understanding if you were good, you had a job, automatically you had a job in here. In 1938, I graduated from the trade school and went to work on a small tool job up in G2, and I stayed there until 1941, and I went in the Navy like all the boys did. We all went in there, and I came back in 1945 and went right back on the tool job because my job was guaranteed by the GI Bill of Rights by the federal government. My boss had to take me back. He wasn't too happy. He wasn't too happy with it because he had trained somebody else that was a perfect man, but he had to take me back. And I was in here for a couple of years working. I realized that it was better outside because we were working 45 hours a week. So the Massachusetts Department of Education ran a little course in Boston, teacher training course, that trade school graduates like myself could go and we could become teachers. And so I did, and many of my friends that had gone through the same story as I'm telling you about went too. We all went to the teacher training, and 100 hours of teacher training, we were put on the state's list that any time a job opened up in a state-aided vocational school, they had to take somebody from that list. So a job opened up in Beverly in 1951, and I went down and applied for it, and I was hired by the director of the vocational school, Claude H. Patton. And meanwhile, my friend Vernon Campbell was already in there. He had gone through, we all went through the same routine. And we taught school. I taught school in the Beverly Cooperative Trade School, which is this, sponsored by this, until 1980. I was in there 29 years. I taught in the Beverly Cooperative Trade School, and retired from there.
What did the shoe mean?
So what I'm going to say is, now, my father came out here with no education. He made sure that I went through Beverly High School, and through the United Shoe Cooperative Trade School, I got an education. And all my children, I were able to send them all to college by what I earned as teaching and from the United Shoe and from the Cummings Center. I was the third generation in 3 generations. That's how it all ended. So,
Thank you.
As the year 2000 approaches, the Cummings Center is having a similar impact as that of the old factory. A brewery and Pat Whitley's television studio have recently rented space in the old foundry. Approximately 75% of the space has been rented as a variety of businesses have moved to the increasingly active site.
Probably one of the most visible projects